The drones were already recording when they dragged him into the chamber, and Ethan Cole did not fight the chains. He walked like a man who had already decided how this would end, and it was not the way the 9 judges above him expected. The Verdant Council chamber rose in tiers of black glass and cold light. Alien faces staring down at the one human standing in the center, wrists bound in humming energy cuffs. 9 species. 9 verdicts already decided before he ever opened his mouth. This was not a trial. It was theater, broadcast across 1,000 worlds. A public execution wearing the mask of justice. Counselor Draith Mole leaned forward, his reptilian eyes catching the light like wet stone. Ethan Cole, human, convicted of unauthorized deep space trespassing into classified council territory. His voice carried the practiced boredom of a man who had said these words 100 times before. The sentence is Exile. Karen 9. A ripple moved through the chamber. Not shock, but something closer to satisfaction. Every species in that room knew what those 2 words meant. Karen 9. The death world. No expedition, no prisoner, no soldier had ever lasted more than 6 days on its surface. Sending someone there wasn't exile. It was a slower, more entertaining way of saying execution. The chairman almost smiled. Any last words, human? The chamber went silent, waiting for fear, for begging, for the broken sound of a species finally understanding its place in the galaxy. Instead, Ethan lifted his head and looked directly into the recording drone hovering beside the judge's platform, not at Draith Mole, not at the crowd, but at the camera, at every living being who would watch this later. And when he spoke, his voice was calm, almost amused. Ask your archives, he said, what the last thing on Karen 9 call home actually is. For 3 full seconds, nobody in that chamber said a word. Because nobody, not even Draith Mole, had an answer. The transport ship that carried him off-world was silent, except for the low hum of the engines and the occasional flicker of the drone camera still trained on his face, still broadcasting, still feeding the galaxy's curiosity about the human who wasn't afraid to die. Ethan sat with his hands still bound, watching the stars blur past the viewport, and somewhere behind his calm expression was a memory the council had never found, a memory buried so deep in a sealed file that even Draith Mole didn't know it existed. 6 years ago, Ethan Cole had already been to Karen 9. He had walked its forests. He had bled in its dirt. And he had made a promise there that no alien species would ever understand, because no alien species had ever needed to. 40 years earlier, humanity had lost a war it barely understood it was fighting. Earth's fleets, outmatched and outnumbered, had been broken in months, and the Verdant Council annexed the planet not as a conquered enemy, but as a curiosity, a species too stubborn to know when it was beaten. Humans became second-class citizens in a galaxy that had already decided what they were worth. Convict labor, expendable soldiers, occasional entertainment for a bored ruling class. Ethan had been Special Forces once, before his unit was quietly disbanded and forgotten, left to rot in the gray spaces between the Council's laws. He became a smuggler after that, not out of greed, but because the alternative was starving quietly in a system built to make sure he never mattered. He read terrain the way other men read faces. He read people the way most men read maps. And 6 years ago, on a Black Ops mission that existed in no official record, he had gone somewhere no human was ever supposed to survive, and found something waiting for him in the dark that the Council did not know was still alive. Now the drop pod doors hissed open above the storm-lashed canopy of Karen 9, and Ethan Cole looked down at the world that had once nearly killed him, the world that had haunted every quiet hour since. Somewhere beneath that bioluminescent forest, something was still waiting, something that remembered him. And as the pod released and the wind screamed up to meet him, one question hung unanswered in the dark. Was he being thrown to his death, or was he finally coming home? The pod hit the canopy like a meteor, tearing through layers of black-veined leaves the size of car doors before slamming into wet earth hard enough to crack the reinforced shell down the middle. Ethan didn't wait for the smoke to clear. He was moving before his own ears stopped ringing, rolling out of wreckage into knee-deep mud, every instinct from a lifetime of war screaming the same warning. You are not alone here. Karen 9 breathed around him. Thick, wet air that smelled like copper and rain, a forest lit from within by veins of blue-green light pulsing through bark like something alive and thinking. Somewhere in the distance, a sound rolled through the trees that wasn't quite a roar and wasn't quite a call. It was something in between, something patient. 6 years of silence hadn't erased a memory of that sound. Ethan's jaw tightened as he pulled a broken piece of the pod's hull free, the closest thing to a weapon he had. The council hadn't given him supplies. No food, no water, no blade sharper than scrap metal. Because they weren't sending him here to survive. They were sending him here to die on camera, a lesson broadcast to every human still foolish enough to believe they mattered. But the council didn't know what Ethan knew. They had read the mission logs of every expedition that came before him, watched every recording end in screaming static, and concluded that Kara 9 was simply death with a name. They had never asked the one question that actually mattered. Why had every single one of those expeditions died in the first 6 days, while something, somewhere on this planet, had let one man walk away alive? He moved through the undergrowth with the controlled quiet of a man who understood that speed gets you killed and patience gets you home. Twice in the first hour he felt eyes on him. Not imagined, not paranoia, but the specific, skin-crawling certainty of being watched by something large enough that its silence was a choice, not a limitation. It didn't attack. It didn't show itself. It simply followed, always a shape at the edge of his vision, always gone the moment he turned to look. That was wrong. Predators didn't do that. Predators didn't wait. A memory surfaced unbidden, sharp as broken glass. Mud-soaked hands pressing against a wound the size of a dinner plate. A creature the size of a transport truck shuddering beneath him, and his own voice hoarse and desperate, saying, "Stay with me. Stay with me," to something that couldn't understand English and didn't need to. He shoved the memory down before it could finish. Not yet. Not until he knew whether 6 years had been long enough for anything on this planet to remember a promise made in blood. 40,000 light years away, in the pale archive towers of the Council homeworld, a young Threll researcher named Vexari sat alone in a records vault long after his shift had ended, staring at a file she wasn't supposed to have access to. Vexari had spent her entire career cataloging the Council's official history, and her species did not tolerate inaccuracy. Threll memory was collective, sacred, and precise, which was exactly why the gaps in Ethan Cole's file bothered her so deeply. A soldier convicted of trespassing into classified territory. Fine, but the coordinates of that unauthorized trespass matched, almost exactly, a mission designation that had been wiped from every official record 6 years earlier. Not redacted, not sealed, erased, the way the Council only erased things it wanted the galaxy to forget existed at all. Her antennae flicked with something between fear and fascination as she pulled up the Exile broadcast, watching the recording of Ethan Cole's final words loop for the 4th time. Ask your archives what the last thing on Karen 9 call home actually is. A challenge, aimed directly at people like her. She should have closed the file. She should have reported the anomaly and let it become someone else's problem. Instead, she found herself opening a deeper archive layer, one buried beneath 11 encryption locks, and felt her chest tighten as the first line of a classified mission log finally loaded onto her screen. Back on Karen 9, night fell in colors no human eye had a name for, and Ethan built no fire, made no sound, trusting the dark the way soldiers learn to trust silence. Somewhere out past the tree line, something enormous shifted its weight, and for the first time since the drop, Ethan allowed himself a single, quiet thought. You remember me, whether that was hope or a death sentence. He wouldn't know until morning. Dawn on Karen. 9 didn't arrive so much as bleed into the sky, gray light filtering through the bioluminescent canopy until the forest looked like the inside of a bruise. Ethan hadn't slept. He'd spent the night with his back against a fallen tree wide as a house, counting the shifting weight of something enormous moving in slow circles just beyond the reach of his eyes. Close enough to hear, never close enough to see. By the time the light changed, his hands had stopped shaking from the cold and started shaking from something else entirely. 6 years of telling himself it was probably dead. 6 years of almost believing it. The Council drone found him an hour after sunrise, its lens catching the glint of dawn as it hovered silently above the canopy, still broadcasting, still feeding his slow death to a galaxy that expected a show. Ethan didn't look up at it. He'd learned a long time ago that the moment you start performing for the camera is the moment you stop paying attention to what's actually kill you. And on Karen 9, that lesson mattered more than anywhere else in the galaxy. He moved deeper into the trees, following a memory of terrain that shouldn't have still lived so clearly in his mind. A ridge line, a river bend, a hollow beneath a cliff face where 6 years ago he had dragged something dying into the shadows and refused to leave. It found him at the river. He heard it before he saw it. Branches the width of his torso snapping like twigs, the ground trembling under a weight that didn't belong to anything that should still be breathing on this planet. Ethan turned, and for the first time in 6 years, he was looking at it again. The Warden was larger than he remembered, armor-plated hide catching the pale light in ridges of black and deep blue. For eyes arranged in a pattern no human evolution had ever produced, a body built for violence that had never once, in this moment, moved to attack him. It simply stood at the tree line, massive head lowered, watching him with an intensity that made his chest ache in a way he hadn't expected. Every instinct in his body screamed run. Every memory in his mind screamed stay. "Yeah," Ethan said quietly, voice rough from a night of silence. "I know. Been a while." The creature didn't move, didn't roar, didn't do any of the things every dead expedition report had described about the horrors of Karen 9. It simply exhaled, a long, low sound that vibrated to the ground beneath Ethan's boots, and took one slow step closer. Not a predator's advance, but something closer to recognition. Ethan felt something twist behind his ribs, a feeling he hadn't let himself feel in 6 years, because feeling it meant admitting how much this moment might actually mean. He didn't know if the council drone above him was capturing any of this. He didn't care. 40 light years away, Vexari sat frozen in the archive vault, 3 encryption layers deep into a file that shouldn't have existed, reading words that made her hands go still on the console. A Black Ops mission designation. 6 years old, wiped from every official council record within 72 hours of its completion. A single human operative. A classified biological asset recovered. No, not recovered. Encountered. The file used a word Vexari had never seen in a council document before. Spared. Her breath caught somewhere in her thorax. Threll memory was sacred, precise, collective. Her entire species existed to preserve the truth of what actually happened, and she was staring at proof that the council had buried the truth so completely that even she, an archivist with security clearance most citizens never dreamed of, had needed 11 layers of encryption just to find its shadow. She thought of Ethan Cole's face on the Exile broadcast, calm in a way that should have been impossible for a man walking towards certain death. Ask your archives what the last thing on Karen 9 call home actually is. He hadn't been threatening the council. He'd been daring them, daring someone like her, to actually look back on the riverbank. The Warden lowered its massive head until its eyes were level with Ethan's, close enough now that he'd feel the heat radiating off its armor hide, close enough that one wrong move from either of them would end everything. Ethan didn't move. He didn't reach for the scrap of metal at his belt. He simply held perfectly still and let 6 years of silence answer for him. And then, slowly, deliberately, the Warden pressed his massive head against his chest, and Ethan Cole, soldier, convict, condemned man, finally allowed himself to breathe. The Warden's breath rolled hot across Ethan's chest, and for one suspended moment, the man who had survived war, exile, and 6 years of nightmares felt something he hadn't let himself feel since the last time he stood on this ground. Relief so sharp it nearly buckled his knees. But relief on Karen 9 never lasted long. The Warden suddenly went rigid, head snapping up, all 4 eyes fixed on something in the canopy above them. Ethan followed its gaze and felt his stomach drop. The council drone, still there, still recording. And now the Warden knew it too. "Easy," Ethan murmured, though he wasn't sure if the word was meant for creature or himself. The Warden let out a low sound, deeper than before, something that vibrated to the mud beneath his boots. Not a threat aimed at him, but a warning aimed at the sky. Ethan understood with sudden clarity exactly what that meant. This creature had let every other expedition die. It hadn't spared him out of mercy toward humanity. It had spared him because 6 years ago, he'd done something no other visitor to this planet had ever done, and the Council's cameras were the enemy of whatever fragile trust existed between them now. He needed to get the drone gone, and fast, before whatever watched this footage back on the homeworld decided the story didn't fit the narrative they wanted broadcast. 40 light years away, Vexari was no longer alone in the archive vault. Commander Israel stood in the doorway, arms crossed, his rigid Asari posture radiating the kind of discipline that came from a lifetime of never questioning an order. "You've been in here 11 hours, he said. "Records archivists don't pull all-nighters over closed cases." "Vexari, what did you find?" She hesitated, fingers hovering over the console, calculating exactly how much of the truth a career soldier could stomach before he reported her. Israel had commanded 3 deployments to contested territories. He believed deeply and sincerely in the Council's mission of order. But he was also, Vexari had learned in the months they'd worked adjacent departments, a man who hated being lied to more than he loved following orders. 6 years ago, she said carefully, a Black Ops team was sent to Kara 9, classified beyond anything I've ever seen. One survivor. She turned the screen toward him. Ethan Cole. Israel's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. The Exile convict. The mission logs say he encountered a biological asset the Council had been tracking for decades. Vexari continued, voice tightening. Something buried on that planet. Something the Council wanted retrieved and failed to retrieve 11 separate times before Cole's mission. And after his mission, after whatever happened down there, the entire operation was wiped. Not filed. Erased. She pulled up the final line of the log, the one that had kept her awake all night. The last entry isn't a mission report. It's a directive. Subject Cole demonstrates unprecedented compatibility with the Karen bio asset. Recommend future retrieval attempts utilize subject as bridge. She looked up at him. Commander, they didn't exile him for trespassing. They exiled him because it was the only way to send him back to Karen 9 without anyone asking why. The silence that followed stretched long enough that Vexari began to regret showing him anything at all. Then Israel said quietly, "There's a retrieval fleet being quietly assembled. I received the deployment orders this morning. I was told it was a routine resource survey." His jaw tightened. "I was told wrong." Back on Karen 9, Ethan pressed his palm flat against the Warden's armored hide, feeling the slow, massive heartbeat beneath the plating, and made a decision that 6 years of careful survival instinct told him was reckless. He climbed, not onto its back like some conquering hero from an old story, but up onto a low outcropping beside it, close enough to be seen clearly by the drone still hovering above, and he looked directly into the lens one more time. "You wanted a show," he said, voice carrying clean and steady across the clearing. "Here it is. Tell your council the last thing on Karen 9 that called this place home isn't a monster." He rested a hand against the Warden's massive skull, and the creature impossibly went still beneath his touch. "It's a promise nobody kept but me." The drone's lens flickered once, twice, and then, as if something on the other end had finally understood exactly what it was looking at, the feed cut to black. The moment the feed died, alarms tore through the Council's central monitoring chamber like a scream. Draith Mole was 3 floors away in a private session when the notification hit his console, and for the first time in decades, the chairman felt something close to genuine alarm. Exile broadcast didn't cut out. They ran until the subject died, every second monetized as a lesson to the rest of the galaxy about what happened to species that forgot their place. A dead feed meant only one of 2 things: equipment failure or something on Karen. 9 had decided it didn't want to be watched anymore. Draith Mole didn't believe in equipment failure. Not on a planet with a body count that high. He summoned Israel within the hour, unaware that the commander had already spent the night staring at a truth he couldn't unsee. "The retrieval fleet," Draith Mole said, pacing the length of his private chamber, reptilian eyes catching the light in sharp, calculating flashes. "Move up the timeline. I want boots on Karen 9 within 72 hours. Israel kept his expression carefully neutral, the discipline of a lifetime holding steady even as something cold settled in his chest. "May I ask what we're retrieving, Chairman?" The mission brief listed as a resource survey. Draith Mole's gaze flicked toward him, unreadable. "You may not." The commander saluted and left, and the moment the door sealed behind him, He pulled out a secure line to Vexari and said 4 words that would set the rest of the story in motion. Leak the file. Now. On Karen 9, Ethan didn't wait to see whether cutting the feed had bought him time or signed his death warrant. He knew the council well enough to know that silence from them was never peace. It was preparation. He climbed down from the outcropping, and the warden shifted alongside him, moving with a fluid, watchful patience that no longer felt threatening, only familiar, like standing next to an old friend who had grown into something far larger than either of them remembered. "You're not the only one left, are you?" Ethan said quietly, more statement than question, remembering the low resonant calls he'd heard echoing through the forest the night before. More than one voice, more than one direction. The warden turned its massive head toward the mountains, rising blue and jagged in the distance, and something in that gesture told Ethan everything he needed to know. There were others, sleeping, waiting, and whatever the council was planning to retrieve from beneath this planet, it wasn't just going to wake up one guardian. It was going to wake up all of them. He needed to reach whatever the wardens had spent thousands of years protecting before the council's fleet arrived and turned this planet into a battlefield neither side fully understood. The warden seemed to sense the shift in his intention, because it turned and began moving through the forest with new urgency, and Ethan realized, with a particular clarity that comes from years of combat instinct, that it wasn't leading him deeper into danger. It was leading him toward the answer. They traveled for 2 days through terrain that would have killed any of the previous expeditions within hours, not because the land itself was hostile, but because the wardens had spent millennia making sure it looked that way to anyone who didn't belong. False paths, sound traps, bioluminescent lures that led straight into bog pits deep enough to swallow a transport ship. Ethan walked through all of it untouched, the warden's presence beside him acting like a key, turning in a lock built specifically to keep everyone else out. On the second night, they reached a valley Ethan had never seen before, even in his memories of 6 years past, and there, half buried beneath centuries of root and stone, stood the curved black surface of something that was not natural, not alive, and not remotely primitive, structured, deliberate, old in a way that made the ancient forest around it look young. Back on the council homeworld, Vexari's leak file was already spreading through restricted channels faster than anyone could contain it. And for the first time in 40 years, ordinary citizens across a dozen worlds were asking a question the council had never wanted asked out loud. What exactly had humanity stumbled onto that was worth bearing an entire mission to hide? Drathmol's retrieval fleet was no longer a quiet operation. It was a race against a truth that was already loose, hurtling toward a planet where a single human stood in a valley, staring at a door built by something older than every species in the council combined, and understood, with a chill that had nothing to do with the night air, that everyone had been asking the wrong question from the very beginning. Nobody had exiled him to die. They had exiled him to open something they were far too afraid to open themselves. The structure rose out of the valley floor like a wound the forest had grown around but never healed, its surface black and seamless, absorbing the pale bioluminescent light instead of reflecting it. Ethan stood at its base with the warden pressed close beside him, and for the first time since landing on Kara 9, he felt genuinely, completely out of his depth. This wasn't alien technology in any sense he recognized. The Council's ships, the Threll archives, even the weapons that had crushed Earth's fleet 40 years ago, all of it had a logic to it, a design language built by minds not so different from his own. This had none of that. The surface pulsed faintly, like something breathing in slow motion, and the warden would go no closer than 30 feet. Its massive body rigid with a tension Ethan had never seen in it before. Not fear exactly. Reverence. He pressed a hand against the cold surface, and the moment his palm made contact, faint lines of light traced outward from beneath his fingers in a spreading web, illuminating symbols carved into black material that matched nothing in any human or alien alphabet he'd ever encountered. And then, low and resonant, a sound rolled out from deep within the structure. Not a voice, not quite, but something that felt disturbingly close to recognition. The ground trembled. Somewhere in the mountains beyond the valley, the warden beside him wasn't the only one answering the call anymore. Distant, echoing roars rippled across the ridgelines. One after another, dozens of them, ancient guardians stirring from a sleep that had lasted longer than any civilization currently alive in the galaxy. 40 light-years away, Drafe Mole stood in the command deck of the Retrieval Fleet's flagship as it dropped out of transit above Karen 9, and the reading scrolling across his console made his blood run cold. Seismic activity across the entire planet. Biological signatures spiking in a pattern his analysts had never seen before. Dozens of massive life forms converging toward a single valley from every direction. "That's impossible," he muttered, staring at numbers that contradicted 40 years of Council intelligence claiming Karen. 9 hosted a single hostile predator species, not an army. Israel, standing at the tactical station, felt the weight of everything Vexari had shown him settle into place. This wasn't a resource survey. This wasn't even a retrieval mission. It was a containment failure the Council had been terrified of for decades, and Ethan Cole, inmate, convict, condemned man, was standing directly in the middle of it. "Commander," Drafe Mole snapped, "prepare ground forces. I want that structure secured and the human eliminated before those creatures reach the site." Israel didn't move for a full 3 seconds, his mind caught between a lifetime of obedience and the leaked file burning in his thoughts. Subject demonstrates unprecedented compatibility with the Karen bioasset, and the growing, sickening certainty that the Council wasn't trying to save anyone. They were trying to erase the one piece of evidence that could prove they'd known about this the entire time. Back in the valley, Ethan felt the structure's light spread further across the black surface, symbols shifting and reforming until, impossibly, a section of the wall folded inward, revealing a passage descending into darkness. The Warden let out a low sound behind him, something between warning and permission, and Ethan understood without being told that this was a threshold few had ever been offered the choice to cross. He thought of his unit, disbanded and forgotten. He thought of the Council chamber, 9 judges deciding his worth in under a minute. He thought of a promise made in mud and blood 6 years ago to a dying creature that owed him nothing and had waited anyway. Above the valley, the sky split open with the arrival of Council dropships, engines roaring against a chorus of ancient guardians rising from the mountains, and Ethan Cole stepped into the dark passage alone, fully aware that whatever waited below might finally answer the one question that haunted this entire planet for thousands of years, and that the answer might arrive at exactly the same moment as an army come to erase it forever. The passage swallowed the light behind him within 20 steps, and Ethan moved through absolute darkness, guided only by the faint pulse of symbols still glowing beneath his palm, where he kept it pressed against the wall. Above ground, he could hear it even through solid stone, the distant thunder of Council dropships breaking atmosphere, the answering roars of Wardens converging on the valley from every direction, a collision building towards something Ethan wasn't sure any side would survive. He kept walking. Whatever waited at the bottom of this passage was the only thing that mattered now, because everything the Council had buried, erased, and lied about for decades was about to come due at once, and he intended to be standing in the one place that held the answer when it did. The passage opened into a chamber vast enough to swallow the darkness whole, lit by the same slow pulse of light, and at its center stood a single sealed vault, ancient beyond anything Ethan could name, humming with a low vibration that he felt in his teeth more than heard. This was it. Not a weapon, not a treasure. Something the precursor civilization had built this entire guardian system to protect from the rest of the galaxy, sealed away so completely that even the Wardens themselves had never been meant to open it, only defend it. And Ethan understood, standing there alone in the dark with Council forces landing above him and ancient creatures answering a call thousands of years old, that his only choice now wasn't to take what was inside. It was to make sure nobody else ever did either. Topside, chaos had already broken loose. Israel stood on a ridge above the valley, watching Council ground forces exchange fire with creatures that outmatched them in size, speed, and sheer desperate fury, and made a decision that would define the rest of his career. "Hold positions," he barked into his comm, cutting against Drafe Mole's direct orders. "Cease fire on the Wardens." That's an order. Around him, soldiers hesitated, torn between 2 commanders and one impossible truth finally breaking into the open. Vexari's leak file was already playing across a dozen public channels back home, and citizens across the Council's own worlds were watching their military open fire on creatures defending something their own government had lied about for 40 years. Deep underground, the vault surface reacted to Ethan's presence exactly as the outer structure had, light spreading beneath his palm, ancient locks disengaging one by one. But something in the chamber's foundation groaned under the strain, and Ethan realized with rising horror that the structure had been built to withstand a forced opening. It had been built to collapse rather than let its contents escape into unworthy hands. The ceiling cracked. Dust and stone rained down around him as the chamber began tearing itself apart, and Ethan understood, in the space of a single heartbeat, that sealing this vault manually from the inside was the only way to stop the collapse from releasing whatever this planet had been protecting for thousands of years across the entire valley above. He worked fast, hands moving across symbols he didn't fully understand, guided by instinct and 6 years of memory, and something that felt disturbingly like trust in a system built by minds long extinct. The ground shook harder. A support beam of black stone gave way behind him, sealing his only path back to the surface. And for one long moment, Ethan Cole stood alone in a collapsing chamber, cut off from the sky, from the war above, from any way out at all. Then the wall beside him exploded inward, and the Warden forced its massive body through solid stone like it was paper. Not for mission, not for the vault, but for him. Because 6 years ago, a stranger had knelt in the mud and refused to leave, and loyalty like that didn't need an order to answer in kind. Together, they reached the final sealed seconds before the chamber gave out completely, and Ethan slammed his palm against the last symbol as the vault sealed itself shut forever, the collapse stopping instantly, the tremors fading into silence. Above ground, as dust settled over a valley finally gone quiet, Council forces stood down under Isso Rail's command, Vexari's evidence spreading too fast and too far for Draith Mole to bury a second time, and the Council's carefully built life finally came apart in full view of the galaxy. Days later, Karen 9 was reclassified. Not a death world, not a weapon vault, but protected territory, the first place among the stars where humanity stood recognized, not as a conquered species, but as something the ancient guardians themselves had chosen to trust. Ethan stood on a ridge overlooking the valley as dawn broke clean and gold across the mountains, the Warden resting its massive head against his shoulder, dozens more gathering in the tree line behind them, patient and unafraid for the first time in thousands of years. He thought of the courtroom, of 9 judges who believed they were signing his death sentence, and allowed himself finally something close to a smile. They called it a death sentence, he said quietly, to no one and everyone at once. Turns out it was just the first place in this galaxy that ever bothered to say thank you,